All right, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be a discussion or a review for Green Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson. This is book number 2 in the Mars Trilogy. I'm not going to hold this book up the whole time. I'm going to set it down. But you want to know what happens in Red Mars, I have a review up for that already. And I'm not going to talk about it too much. I'll just give like a real quick recap for that. So in Red Mars, it began in the year 2026. Well, the Ares, the ship that takes the scientists to Mars, launches in 2026. It's a 9-month trip. They arrive in 2027. And then that book covers a time span of, let's see, from 2027 to, it ends like in 2061. So that crew was comprised of 35 Americans, 35 cosmonauts, and then 30 people from various other countries, and the various conflicts that arise between them. One of the main ones that continues on into this book is the struggle between those that want to terraform the planet, which are known as Greens, which the head of those is the character Sax Russell, who is the terraformer of the group, and Anne Claiborne, who was against terraforming. Now, one of the things that Kim Stanley Robinson did in order that he can have these recurring characters over these large gaps of time, which is something I didn't talk about in Red Mars, but I'm going to discuss it here because it's a major plot point of the series, is that humans developed genetic, I don't know what you would call it, gene therapy or rewriting the DNA code for increased lifespan. All right, so a lot of these characters that when we get to the end of this book, it's been 100 years. This book ends in October of, I think it's October. Anyways, it goes all the way up through the year 2127. So that is 100 years after these, what they call the original 100, landed on Mars. And many of them are still alive, although they are in advanced age. So some of the characters that we're going to focus on in this book are Anne Claiborne and Sax Russell. Those are going to be the big ones, although some of our Russian characters are going to be back featured prominently as well. Maya Toitovna, I can't say her name to save my life. Nadia Chernyshevsky, she's going to be a major character here. Of course, Hiroko, the Japanese biotech expert, and then Michel Duval, the French psychiatrist, are going to return in this novel as well. We do get some new characters introduced, one of the major ones being Nergal, who is Hiroko's son. So Hiroko had taken off and formed like a, I don't know, like a secret colony or something, and she has used genetic engineering to start some sort of weird fertility cult with herself at the head of it. She's bred a bunch of children through, I don't know, in vitro fertilization or something. She took genetic material from her fellow astronauts and cosmonauts and bred a bunch of babies, which she is the mother of, which is very strange. Nergal being one of them. His mother is Hiroko. One of the other characters that we get here that was touched upon very slightly in Red Mars is Desmond Hawkins, who is known as the Coyote. He was a stowaway on board the Ares that came to Mars, who was, I guess his past is he was a lover of Hiroko in times past. They met in college and she helped him get aboard the ship and smuggle him to the Red Planet. And he wasn't really in the first book hardly at all, but we get a lot of time with him in this one. There are a lot of shifts of POV between the various characters. Jackie Boone is another character that's introduced in this. She is one of Hiroko's children, who is the offspring of John Boone, the first man on Mars. She's going to be not really a front and center character, but she's one of the new ones that's introduced. So we have kind of a mix of some of the old and a mix of some of the new. Okay? Now, I'm going to get into, this book is much more political than the first book was. although politics kind of underlied the first book, this one is really starting to show and reveal Kim Stanley Robinson's political ideology, which is Marxist. He identifies himself as a democratic socialist. And one of the first things that really stuck out to me in this novel was Anne Claiborne. Of course, she's one of our red characters, the ones that don't want to terraform. And for some reason, out of left field, this is on page 122 in the copy I have here, she is listening or reading a biography of Fyodor Dostoevsky. And this took me kind of by surprise because it came out of nowhere reading this book. So she's out driving around, and it says here, let's see. One afternoon, reading randomly in the AI to distract herself between her return to the car and her dinner hour, she learned that the Tsarist police had taken Dostoevsky out to be executed. Of course, she's talking about the 19th century Russian writer, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was a member of the Petrashevsky Circle, who was arrested by the Tsar's secret police and then sentenced to be executed. So she's reading about this. Of course, he wasn't executed. He was released, and this was a very transformative moment in the life of Fyodor Dostoevsky. So let's see here. What does she say? The Tsarist police had taken Dostoevsky out to be executed and only brought him back in after several hours of waiting for his turn. Anne finished reading about the incident and sat in the driver's seat of her car, feet on the dash, staring at the screen blindly. Another garish sunset poured through the window over her, the sun weirdly large and bright in the thickening atmosphere. Dostoevsky had been changed for life, the writer declared in the easy omniscience of biography. An epileptic, prone to violence, prone to despair, he hadn't been able to integrate the experience, perpetually angry, fearful, possessed. Anne shook her head and laughed, angry at the idiot writer who simply didn't understand. Of course you didn't integrate the experience. It was meaningless. The experience that couldn't be integrated. So Anne is a materialist. She's grounded in Darwin's theory of evolution. She's scientific. I don't know if she's espousing even, Buddhist beliefs or whatever, but to her, Dostoevsky's experience meant nothing. It was a total waste of time. I'm not sure if this is coming from Kim Stanley Robinson's Buddhism, okay, because he identifies himself as a Buddhist. And in order to understand a little bit about Dostoevsky, right, like Dostoevsky's kind of called an existentialist, along with characters like Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who the onus is on, or the focus is on, the experience of the individual, right? Dostoevsky's novels are very psychological. They very much deal with the human psyche. And this experience of being released by the Tsar at the last minute from execution was a transformative event in Dostoevsky's life. And here Anne is just completely dismissing it as meaningless. Well, it could be possibly that Kim Stanley Robinson, KSR, being a Buddhist or identifying himself as a Zen Buddhist, you look at the concept of the soul, all right, the human soul. Buddhism rejects this. Now, in Hinduism, you have the concept of the Atman, right? That's the soul. And that Buddhism in Hinduism teaches like that life is kind of illusory and everybody is just part of Brahman. And the whole goal is to achieve nirvana, realizing that you are God and God is you. The Atman, the soul, is God. So you're like a little God or a part of God, part of the divine. Well, Buddhism teaches the concept of the an-Atman, like the soullessness, the no self, the denial of a soul, and that the ego, right? Your individuality is an illusion, and that the ego is the source of suffering. So the idea in Buddhism is to uncouple yourself from passions, from attachments, from desires, in essence, to achieve emptiness and realize that your existence is an illusion. Yeah. So obviously, a person that believes in that would look at Dostoevsky and think he's a fool. But perhaps there's another reason why Kim Stanley Robinson thinks that Dostoevsky is a fool, and that would be Dostoevsky's reaction against utilitarianism and against Marxist and communist ideologies. So later in the book, and by the way, I want to say something about KSR's influences. One of his professors that he studied under was Professor Frederick Jameson, a Marxist literary critic, and he was Robinson's PhD supervisor at the University of California, San Diego. The man had a profound influence on his life, and I've listened to a couple of interviews by KSR, and he mentions that Frederick Jameson wasn't just a teacher, but he was a friend. And so he took in a lot of this man's teaching and ideology, being a, Californian Zen Buddhist Marxist hippie, which is, I don't know how you integrate or synthesize Buddhism with Marxism, because Buddhism is anti-material and Marxist is the materialistic ideology. So he's trying to synthesize this two very vastly different philosophies and make them work. But anyways, we're just going to move on from this, and we're going to get into the character of Nadia Chernyshevsky. This was our commandant engineer that appeared in book number 1. Now, I didn't immediately recognize it at first, but it kind of jumped out at me. There is a part 7 of this book, okay? As you can see, the titles there, the headings of the various parts. Look at part 7. What does it say? It says, "What is to be done?" That is the chapter title. Now, our character, Nadia Chernyshevsky, she's a Marxist. If you look at her name, there was a 19th century Russian revolutionary novelist and philosopher named Nikolai Yarolovich Chernyshevsky. Same last name. So clearly, Nadia is calling back to this man. Well, he wrote a book. Guess what the title of it was? The title was "What is to be done?" A phrase that appears over and over again in the Mars Trilogy, at least so far, and is an actual title for part number 7. I don't think it's a coincidence. It's done deliberately. Well, Nikolai Yarolovich Chernyshevsky he wrote this novel, What is to be Done, and it was praised both by Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin as a point of inspiration, and they both really liked his writing and his ideology. He identified kind of with the utopian socialist movement and Russian nihilism, and Dostoevsky was very critical of Chernyshevsky's novel, What is to be Done. In fact, he wrote a response to it. Notes from Underground makes reference to that book, What is to be Done, as well as does Dostoevsky's masterwork, one of his 4 master novels, Demons. That book is really concerned with Russian nihilism, with revolutionary ideas. In fact, Dostoevsky likened these revolutionary ideals, whether it be liberalism, communism, socialism, utilitarianism, all these, ideas coming out of really the French Revolution. He's very critical of them and made it abundantly clear throughout his works. So you can see there why Kim Stanley Robinson would take a dig at Dostoevsky in Green Mars, because Dostoevsky stands opposed to the things that are being pushed in these books. So this is almost like a science fiction version, this trilogy, a science fiction version of Chernyshevsky's utopian socialism. And you see a lot of like really progressive ideals in here that I can't get on board with. Now, I'm already 2 books deep into the series, so I'm going to finish the last one, but I'm now reading it with a more critical eye. And this really isn't so much science fiction novels as it is a Marxist philosophy kind of wrapped in the veneer of sci-fi. So it is communist science fiction, comrade. One of the things that was abundantly even more noticeable towards the end of the book is when Nadia Chernyshevsky begins to talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, because as the date on this page opens up, it is the month of October, and she's thinking about the Bolshevik Revolution. So I'll read a passage here, and then I'm going to close things out. So she says, let's see, this is on page 559. She's talking about the date. It was just after dawn on what was looking to be a warm spring day, the kind that had allowed them to work in loose walkers and hoods and face masks, with only the insulated hard boots to remind Nadia of the bulky clothing of the early years. Friday, LS 101, 2 July 2, Mars year 52, Terran date, she checked on her wrist pad, October 12th, 2127. Somewhere near the end of the 100th anniversary of their arrival, though it was a date no one seemed to be celebrating. 100 years. It was a bizarre thought. Another July Revolution. Then, and another October Revolution, too. A decade past the bicentennial of the Bolshevik Revolution, she seemed to remember, which was another strange thought. Well, but they, too, had tried. All the revolutionaries all through history, mostly desperate peasants fighting for their children's lives, as in her Russia. So many in that bitter 20th century risking all to make a better life, and even so it had led to disaster. It was frightening, as if history were a series of human wave assaults on misery, failing, time after time. But the Russian in her, the cerebellum Siberian, decided to take the October date as a good auspice. So yeah, she's a revolutionary figure, obviously sympathetic to the Bolshevik Revolution and Marxism. I'll have more to say on this when I finish Blue Mars, because a book that I read recently, which is very prescient in my mind as I'm reading through Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars Trilogy, is this book by Father Seraphim Rose, who was an Orthodox priest, hero monk, right, who died in or reposed back in 1982. This is Nihilism, the Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age, in which he offers a critique of revolutions and revolutionary movements. And he does like an epistemic critique of them on the question of truth in the introduction. So at some point, I will probably do a read through or touch on some of these key points, because he goes through like 4 stages of the nihilist dialectic. He goes through a criticism of liberalism, a criticism then of what he calls the second stage of the nihilistic dialectic, which is realism. Then the third stage that he begins to delve into is vitalism, something that was very important to, for instance, Friedrich Nietzsche, you know, life-affirming vitalist, which leads kind of into absurdism. And then the final stage is of the dialectic there is the nihilism of destruction, right? Like just total crumbling in chaos. So I'm not going to get into that today, but I'll probably do a critique of Kim Stanley Robinson's book once I finish Blue Mars, because it really feels like it's tending towards utopianism, that of like Chernyshevsky, or, you know, Nietzsche was very critical of utilitarianism and utopianism as well. Of course, his wasn't really focused on the Russian utopist, but his critique was on John Stuart Mill's, all right, and the English utilitarianism. So I have something to say on this. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. And if, you know, you're not interested in hearing the opinions of a Orthodox reactionary, because I very much identify with Fyodor Dostoevsky and his viewpoints, then you may want to move on someplace else, because I really don't have a lot of sympathy for Marxism. Obviously, the number of people that were killed under Marxist regimes in the 20th century. I mean, anybody that's got a problem with religion and say, oh, the Crusades and Holy Wars, the atheists killed way more people than Christians and Muslims ever killed throughout history. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.